were giving a talk on a project you've been working on. I believe the title is Global Brands versus Urban Neighborhoods. Is that right?
Local neighborhoods. Yeah.
Local neighborhoods. Tell me about that. What question are you trying to answer?
Right. We're trying to answer, or at least look into it. It's a project in the sense of a long-term development, a study, research piece, initiative. And cities are currently being compared at all times and placed into indices and categorized. And depending what indices, what benchmarks they're using, they say, okay, these are the best cities for livability, these are the best cities of opportunities for business, etc. And everybody's trying to scramble into the top 10. But the data that these indices are built around are very opaque, and nobody quite knows how the data is actually erased or collected and then analyzed. What we do know is how they sometimes weight the data, so the criteria, how it's weighted, but not where the data comes from. And especially, you can't necessarily say something about the city per se. You can't say, Sydney's better than San Francisco, or are we as good as London? While so the local part is referring to the actual experience and livability of a neighborhood. So a city is composed of many neighborhoods.
Right.
And when we usually talk about the city, we as a brand, or the collective as a brand, thinks of Sydney as the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House and a bit of CBD, right?
Sure.
So it is kind of the historic center, but it's not representative actually of the city.
All right.
So the study that we've done, we've had 20 years of experience of actually doing spatial analysis into how people behave and use and perceive spaces. So we simulate these behaviors and perceptions to design with. And so we used public data as well as our own spatial analysis and people analysis to understand how neighborhoods vary. So there's no such thing as the city. There's only a lot of neighborhoods. And we do find out how these historic centers are compared versus actually how these historic centers compare to the rest of the neighborhoods within the city.
So let's just slow down for 1 second. And what data exactly are you talking about? What actual data sets are you using?
So there is about 30% of our models are built around public data. So that's the data that everybody else is using as well.
And that's things like what?
It's employability, it's income, for example, statistical census demographics.
Okay.
And you can, of course, get building footprints and heights, FAR, densities, right?
Right, okay.
These kind of more common and publicly available data sets. But what they don't tell you is about how accessible are various amenity mixes. What's the ratio between certain kindergarten place offers and residential units? How safe do we feel in the street, or how enclosed do we feel about it? So the experience of walking through the streets. So these experiential as well as operational qualities.
How do you measure those things objectively?
So we built, yes, exactly. So in the past, of course, there were empirically measured in a way that you go into the field, you do your field study. And nowadays, apart from the field study, which we do when there's no data available, when there's no geometry even available of the city.
You just go and observe and take notes about how people
You can, but then we have built a system, a platform, which allows you to crunch the city in a few days, which then produces a set of spatial and operational metrics, outputs, that you can add to the rest of the 30%, which makes roughly our 100, so roughly 30-70.
And what are the inputs for that platform then, if the output is this?
It's interesting because the inputs are often fairly minimal. So what we need is a street network, building footprints, and then we get from social media, for example, land uses that are not in the maps, for example, yeah.
What social media data are you gathering?
Well, we can, for example, get activation hotspots from social media. We can get from other sources like OpenStreetMap. You can get amenity points and land users. So you layer various sources, but then you need to actually simulate on top, or analyze and simulate on top of those. So simulation being, for example, distances or enclosures and or layers of that. How many flows do you get through a street due to connectivity versus the land users along these streets, for example. Yeah? So you get a whole series of conditions that you can map that are not in the public domain, that require specialist understanding how spaces work, so spatial analysis in that sense. And from that, you get a much more differentiated picture of cities and neighborhoods. And as I said, some of the findings are that, of course, we think of the city that we see in the brochure and in these indices as just a tiny part, which is historic,
Right.
branded area of a city, but not at all representative of the rest of the city. Yeah.
So what's a good example of some conclusion you reached or some assessment you made of a city that was surprising or that, you know, contradicted what the typical idea based on the publicly available data sets that might also be analyzed?
Interesting, one of the assumptions that we had, for example, was that while we know that for example, CBDs are often built around historic centers. You look at, you know, the old one in London, apart from Canary Wharf. Right. New York is in the old New Amsterdam, actually, area around Wall Street. Sure. Here in the CBD Manhattan. In Sydney, everywhere, effectively, right? There's a move away from this, but traditionally that was the model. And we thought as you can observe often, that on a weekend or evening, these financial centers aren't activated very much. Right. That there would also be a lower provision of public facilities, amenities, such as schools, hospitals. Yeah. But we found that, for example, to be interesting that while these old historic centers are now financial centers often, have a high walkability because they had smaller grain and more connections between streets. Right.
Because they were initially planned before
Exactly,
cars.
They were initially planned before cars. We thought then hospitals would have moved with the residential centers, but they're still pretty much situated around these financial centers. So they have a similarly high value as residential suburban areas in cities. So they have these really high quality, livable breakdown, apart from activation, for example. That was an interesting one to find.
Is it your goal to provide prescriptions then for architects, or are you just putting this data out there so that they can draw their own conclusions? I mean, in that case, it sounds like you'd be saying that Wall Street or some analogous neighborhood that might be underutilized as a residential neighborhood based on that data.
That's correct. I mean, the underutilization is one thing that comes out of our study. So the assumption that there's no activation is correct. We can find it from transport data activation, find it from land use patterns. But the purpose why we originally did the study was not because we wanted to do the study. It was because we wanted to find a way of being able to profile places for briefing, so that we understand, we have a good grasp of a location's profile of a place. What does make a place tick? What's its dynamic? So if you come in as an architect or a developer, that you've got a very good idea of what needs to be developed, what doesn't need to be developed, what can you share with the rest of the city around you. And that you as a user, you don't just build somewhere randomly, but you actually think, all right, if I want to develop a certain type of new environment and share some of the perks or share some of the amenities, then this would be the right location for you versus maybe another user would be better placed over here, right? So that's how we started, and it has turned into this large database that we can now visualize insights through. But that's the side effect, effectively, of the study that I showed today. I mean, the study is a side effect,
Right. Yeah. Is this available to anyone who wants it through like a subscription model, or how do people access this data?
Not quite yet. We're still compiling as we go along. Every city that we work in, we then eventually create the city profile, right? So we effectively, every project, we're increasing the database by another city. So now we're at about 15 or 20, and globally different cities, 5 in Australia.
Are you trying to influence planners as well, that you might be able to influence how people plan for the city because now they have access to different kinds of data?
What we currently think might be useful for city planners, apart from understanding the strengths and weaknesses of various places and maybe where one neighborhood falls behind another, etc., that we see how zoning might have an effect on the development of cities as well, where zoning is kind of a blunt tool. To say you have to do this here and you have to do that here, although that may be actually shared more by the street that they're facing both than kind of a zone, right? So that's an interesting one for planning, that we can see how you possibly can create more intelligent zoning models.
Like what?
Well, where you have multi-layer zones. Instead of saying this is a zone X and zone Y, you have mixed-use zones, but these mixed-use are often quite simply interpreted by development or by developers into a bit of cafe, the basement, and but it doesn't really touch often public infrastructure and community facilities at all, right? So there is a scope for much better use of the zoning tool, if you like, and making it more complex, in fact. And the complexity you can see and start to understand it through these visualized data mining models, right? Yeah. They're not just data models, they're also, as I said, simulations that you then build interpretations of cities through mapping. It used to be called mapping in the 90s.
You mentioned this feeds into the brand of a city. What do you mean by that?
The contrary is the case. So the brand of a city is that we think of it as an image. So as I mentioned, Sydney being the bridge and the opera house and beaches, right? But that's not how Sydney operates, and that's not how people live in Sydney. So we managed to look under the bonnet and say, right, this is the brand, the globally perceived brand. And we show you how the neighborhoods locally operate and how livable they actually are. And that the brand of Sydney is not reflected at all on the ground through the neighborhoods, or at least not across the neighborhoods at all, right? That there's very different brands within the neighborhoods, if you like, that actually align globally to other neighborhoods and different cities more than to Sydney as a brand, for example.
Are you pushing back against the idea of comparing cities on a global scale in the first place, or is it just about comparing them on more equal terms?
Comparing them in more equal terms, definitely. And understanding the data, where it comes from and how it's been raised, and instilling definitely more people-centric data into it, or spatial-centric data rather than economic. It's a large part often is economic in these indices, and climatic and energy, what have you, and employability, but not how you live, right?
I guess it's difficult though, because everyone wants to click on that article that says, here are the 10 most walkable cities in the world, or what have you.
We didn't want to create an index ourselves, right? We just want to use this for better design, right? To understanding your site and your place better, so you create a more sensitive and responsive environment, really.
Does that have any specific implications for tall buildings? Or designers of tall buildings?
Well, it's interesting. In 2008, we developed a model for the CTBUH at the time to show the contrasting densification potentials of different transport systems. So we used to buy in London as two different systems, and we simulated a tall building having a certain GFA or density effectively in terms of area. And if you operate that building, how much supplementary or auxiliary land uses you need to plan for a certain size building, tall building. And of course, at the time we could show, depending on how you service that density, you'd create a sprawl, a low-dense sprawl, or a very densified active neighborhood, if you like. And that's still the same in that sense. Now we can look back at this model. Then we simulated without data, we just simulate the mechanism behind it, right? Nowadays we have the data, but if you put the two together, you actually have a very good planning model of understanding how a tall building is actually affecting its neighborhoods. Or, seeing that we have our Civitas model, understanding what the actual mix and provision is already around the site, you can say, all right, this can actually afford a certain density of new tall building, or at what cap do you have to set it, if you like.
Isn't there a problem or a danger here that you'll end up with homogeneous skylines or homogeneous cities, because now everyone's got access to this data and they want to compete with other cities around the world, so they want to be better than the other one. They want to use that data in the same way, that you end up with kind of a globalized international city to the detriment of local conditions.
That's right, and that's our veiled critique here of these global indices, that nobody quite knows where the data comes from. And people just weigh it according to what they want to express in these indices. But and we're saying that's just 30% of the data we're using. We're using 70% of behavioral and perceptive and operational data on the ground, from the ground, that we simulate ourselves. So you start to see the differentiation a lot more, and therefore you can actually get a grasp or a really good description of a local place, which you won't be able to simulate or just replicate elsewhere because it's dependent on its context. Whereas these global indices, they're just looking for them to be targets, that you need to sort of get towards. But they don't ask themselves, how do you operate and how do you behave in those places, which are much harder to craft. These are design instructions rather than just targets to measure yourself against. Yeah. So they're not effectively at all homogenizable, however you want to say it,
Sure.
call it. Yeah.